So this week I interviewed for my podcast the Booker Prize winning author Sir Ben Okri, and he is often labeled with in the category of being a writer of magical realism, and that is a genre of literature that seems very enticing and very exciting, and it's one that he rejects wholeheartedly. And I was kind of curious about how one might define magical realism, why one might reject a label like that, what was the origin of this genre, where is it going, is it now in a place where it doesn't mean anything anymore? So there were a lot of different questions I had, and I thought I would kind of investigate these with you live right now. Okay, so let's begin by defining what magical realism is and what it isn't. It's often conflated wrongly with fantasy, and that's kind of wrong. Magical realism is a genre where magic is presented in an otherwise very realistic setting as something that's quite matter of fact and accepted by all participants in this reality as perfectly normal. And the aim of magical realism is therefore to try and explain reality in a way that real realism might not be able to. The magic gives some sort of contrast to reality, and it helps the writer give reality a more three-dimensional shape, let's say. So the key difference between magical realism and fantasy is that in fantasy, part of the idea is to try and understand how and why the magic is working and try and divine what powers are going to magically be used to advance the story. In magical realism, the magic is not really questioned. It is part of the landscape. It serves, again, to give another dimension to the reality because it seems so commonplace and yet it is so odd. Magical realism is often most associated with the region of Latin America, and that's because some of the greatest works of magical realism have come from there. But it's not actually where it was born. It was first coined by a German art critic called Franz Roh in 1925, who used the term to describe a style of painting where everyday mundane objects were given a slightly magical quality by the painter, and therefore there was a different tonality and aura that arose from that art. And this idea gradually made its way across continents to a Cuban writer called Alejo Carpentier, who published a book called The Kingdom of This World. And in the preface of that book, he introduced the idea that actually Latin America is a pretty amazing place. It has a pretty incredible reality in and of itself, and it doesn't really need magic. It is by itself quite magical in its reality. And that idea gradually made its way in Latin American literary circles until it landed in the book of a Colombian writer called Gabriel Garcia Marquez in his landmark 1967 novel called 100 Years of Solitude, which is the epitome of magical realism. It is the book that launched 1,000 books on that subject. And in that Colombian family saga, you basically have a lot of weird magical events that occur and nobody bats an eyelid, and it is part of the fabric of this region, part of the fabric of Colombia. This genre lends itself particularly well to Latin America because of the variety of influences that were permeating the region, from European colonial ideas to indigenous traditions to Catholicism to African ideas coming with the slaves and voodoo and the lush countryside and the jungle. All of these factors kind of came together in this weird mélange and gave rise to a space where weirdness was authorized and reality could be composed of different levels of understanding, including some very, very weird ones. The key themes of magical realism, basically expressed through this landmark novel, 100 Years of Solitude, are themes of memory and family and identity and nature, not to mention the political legacy of colonial systems and how that impacted the political landscape of these Latin American countries that could best be described or satirized in these slightly tangential, magical ways under regimes that were not necessarily friendly. The rise of magical realism definitely coincided with a political moment in Latin American history where there was a lot of instability, a lot of dictatorship, both far right and far left, coups left, right, and center. And the literary scene felt that the best way to express any opposition or resistance to this political instability was through the use of this very allegorical magic and the possibility of talking about things that one was not really allowed to talk about in ways that were maybe a little bit encrypted in local lore and myth that allowed people to understand some references without ever being too explicit about them. Now, when you talk about magical realism, people automatically think, oh, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And he is undoubtedly the kind of godfather of it all. But there are a lot of other writers who have written with magical realism very successfully and who aren't necessarily Latin American, but one might be able to cite Isabel Allende, the Chilean author, who's also associated with that movement. You can look at a British Indian writer like Salman Rushdie, who used that genre very successfully with his book Midnight's Children, which won the Booker Prize, and that also utilizes elements of magic to address issues of politics and colonialism with his native India. In the US, you've got a writer like Toni Morrison, who played a little bit with that form, most notably with her novel Beloved, where a former slave living in Ohio is haunted by a specter. And everybody seems to think it's kind of normal that there's a ghost floating around. The point is not that there's a ghost floating around. The question is, why is there a ghost floating around? What might the ghost represent? But actually, like Sir Ben Okri, Toni Morrison rejects that label. And so now maybe it might be time to examine why specifically writers like Ben Okri and Toni Morrison reject the label. And it's because it did eventually become associated with a certain foreignness, a certain exoticism, Orientalism of sorts, that, oh, it's only magical realism if it happens to brown people. Who can only talk about it and only talk about colonialism in that form. Another major reason that a writer like Sir Ben Okri rejects the label is because to him, the spirit world and its magic is actually not necessarily magic at all. It is simply an alternative plane of reality, one that is equally valid as a plane of reality as what we consider reality. And in his African tradition, looking at the spirit world on equal terms is a perfectly normal thing to do, and there's nothing magical about it. And so that's why he rejects that categorization. But like all things that are super successful, magical realism eventually started eating its own tail, let's say. And it's a genre that doesn't come without criticisms. The first big criticism is that, well, it became a very commercial thing, and publishers began bandying the term about quite loosely, applying it to a lot of literature of very variable quality. And I myself have read a number of books from Latin America and beyond that were labeled as magical realist, and they were really not very good. I mean, I realize that applies to all genres, of course, but here it became a bit of a marketing thing that was kind of connected to Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Latin American literature and so on and so forth. The second thing is that it can become relatively trite relatively quickly. I mean, how many ghosts, how many prophecies, how many spirits can you have before it becomes a little bit obvious what is happening? So it's a genre that can run quite thin quite quickly, and that's a little bit what happened. It became quite easy to generate caricatures of the genre rather than utilizing it for its full potential. But ultimately, magical realism can still really work and function if it's used in a pretty authentic way, and that is in a way that's designed to explore the trauma of the region's history, of the region's political instability, the violence behind European colonialism, later wars in the region, and just the general trauma that's afflicted a lot of people. Magical realism can help to create explanations and build bridges in historical interpretations that make more sense than just a literal truth that might ignore a lot of the dimensions and shapes of the region. So that was a short primer in magical realism and what it is and what it isn't. I'm sure a lot of you have read a number of books in that genre. I'd love to hear from any of you which ones spoke to you the most, which ones you found intelligent, which ones you thought were a bit trite. Let's get a discussion going. Leave your thoughts in the comment. And in the meantime, please don't forget to subscribe and keep reading. Thanks a lot. Bye.